My name is Sarah, and this is our family's adoption story. I've been part of the Soteria family for about 2 years. I am a mom of 6 who range in age from 11 to 28. My 4 sons are biological, and both my daughters were adopted out of foster care 9 years ago. The Lord placed the desire for adoption in my heart as a young child. My grandparents had a bookshelf full of these Reader's Digest condensed novels that they would receive every month, probably on a subscription basis. And there wasn't a whole lot I could do entertainment-wise as a child of the 70s and 80s, so I read a lot. And I remember reading a story about a U.S. serviceman who returned to Vietnam after the war and adopted a little girl that he had met in an orphanage while serving over there. I read the story and I remember thinking, I'm going to do that someday. And a few years later, I met my husband and I told him that I wanted to adopt, and he said that sounded great to him. So we got married and we had our first 3 boys in the first few years of marriage, and life was busy. Gradually, the thought of adoption moved from the forefront of my mind more towards the back. But yet, when I would hear of people I knew who had adopted, I would feel a pang of jealousy. And every November, a TV station would air a special for National Adoption Month where they would highlight waiting children and interview families who had already adopted. And I would get teary-eyed every single year that I would watch that, and I didn't know why. And then we had our 4th son, and he arrived quite a few years after his older brothers. And as far as I was concerned, our family was complete. I was busy, I enjoyed being a boy mom, and life was good. And then when Sam, that last son, was about 2, the Lord began poking at my heart. It almost became like a drumbeat. I felt him telling me, you need to look into adoption. I would pick up something to read and it would be about adoption. I'd turn on the radio, they would be talking about adoption. And I told God why this really wasn't a good idea. I pointed out to him that we already had 4 children, and that seemed kind of like a lot to me. One of our boys has significant special needs and will need some sort of care the rest of his life. How could I do that and have more children to take care of? There was, as far as I knew, adoption was pretty pricey, and our bank account was certainly not robust. We barely had room in the house for the kids we already had. We couldn't add more to that. And then there was our age, and I kind of laugh about this now, but at the time our 40th birthdays were looming, and it just seemed to me like 40 was a portal to death's waiting room. Even if we were to pursue adoption, there's no way an agency would ever consider us. But that didn't seem to deter God. He still kept poking at my heart, telling me you need to look into adoption. So finally I told the Lord, okay, this is what we're going to do. If you want us to adopt, you have my husband come speak to me about it. I won't say a word to him. And so for 9 months, I made sure the word adopt never once crossed my lips. And then Paul and I were on a date night a few months later, well, 9 months later, and he leans across the table and he says to me, so what would you think about adopting? I had my answer. And at first I was kind of excited, but in the weeks that followed, fears crept in. All the reasons I had given God the previous spring for why adoption wasn't a good idea rushed to the front of my mind. I suddenly began remembering every negative, disappointing story I'd heard about adoptions that hadn't worked out well. I was convinced that nobody would ever consider us as adoptive parents anyway, even if we were to pursue it. And I knew more than anything that if we did this, we were walking into certain pain. And I don't know how I knew that, but I knew it was there and it was waiting for us. And who wants to sign up for that? Towards the end of that spring, my husband asked me, so what are you thinking about adoption? You've been really quiet about this. And so I told him some of these concerns of mine. And I remember telling him, what if we do take in a child? What if we pour everything we have into this person and someday they walk away from us, they reject us? And as I said those words to my husband, I immediately had an image of Christ hanging on the cross come into my mind. His arms were outstretched, and he was loving a world, many of whom would walk away from him and reject him. How could I do less? And then for Mother's Day that year, Paul gave me a letter that he had written. He had poured his heart out into these pages. They were peppered with Bible verses, and he expressed his firm belief that God was calling us to adoption and that he was calling us to pursue it now. And he was also convinced that God was going to give us at least one daughter. So I said, okay, we'll do this. I didn't know how it was going to work out. I didn't know how it would end up, but we would try. We tentatively began pushing on doors, and to our surprise, they flew open. It didn't take long, and we soon decided that going through the foster care system was the best option for us. Within a matter of months, we were licensed and ready for children. We began doing respite care, and this was a very valuable experience because it helped shift our focus away from what we wanted, which was another child, to the needs of children in foster care. And this served us well when our girls arrived. In June of that year, I drove to the north side of Des Moines to a temporary foster home to meet our girls and to bring them home. I remember walking up to the porch. Lizzie was 3.5. Ellie was a few days away from her first birthday. The girls were a different race than I am, and I remember seeing them and thinking they were the most beautiful children I had ever seen in my life. Lizzie put her hand on her hip and she looked me up one side and down the other and hissed, they should have given us to a black family. We were off to a great start. And truthfully, those first few months were really hard. And there were parts of them that were fun. For the first time, I was getting to buy frilly little dresses and hair bows, things I'd never needed before. But there was so much work. I felt like my workload had doubled overnight. Lizzie really seemed to dislike me. It was hard on my boys. This time was hard on our marriage. But it got easier. During the next few months, termination happened. The girls began calling me Mom. Lizzie seemed to hate me a little bit less. And the path looks clear for adoption. And then 2 weeks before what would have been the 1-year anniversary of the girls being with us, my 42-year-old husband went to bed one night and he never woke up. He experienced a seizure while he was sleeping and he suffocated to death. I remember that night that the ambulance was sitting in my driveway and I couldn't figure out why they weren't speeding off into the night. And then the sheriff's deputy walked around back and came to me and told me, I'm so sorry, but your husband didn't make it. And after I absorbed that initial blow, my very first thought was about the girls. What was going to happen to them now? And I remember thinking, things would probably be easier if I gave them back because they weren't adopted yet and I could do that. But I couldn't stand the thought of what it would do to them to have another disrupted placement after all the progress that had been made this last year. And what would it do to the boys and I to lose them too? But then was it morally all right for me to keep them? Because now there wasn't going to be a father in the home. And so I wrestled these things out in the span of those few moments. And the next morning I called the Department of Human Services and let them know what had happened. And a few days later, in fact, it was about 2 hours before we had to leave for my husband's viewing at the church, they called me back and they said, if you want to keep the girls, you are more than welcome to do so. So 3 months later, I adopted them, and we began figuring out how to be a family. There were now more of us, but there was one fewer. Parenting itself is not the easiest job. Single parenting, it's hard. And single parenting children who are grieving and who have early trauma wounds is even harder. But God has been so faithful to us. He has provided everything we've needed. He has provided healing. He has provided financially. He has given strength and wisdom that weren't mine. He has been our Jehovah Jireh. The day the girls were adopted, they asked me to come to the front of the courtroom. And I didn't know what to expect. I thought maybe we were going to sign paperwork. I had never attended an adoption hearing before. But I remember going to the front, and the lawyer for the state asked me, why should we allow you to adopt the girls? And it took me a moment, but I remember leaning into the microphone and saying, these girls were born to another woman, but they were created to be mine. And I believe that with all my heart. God delights in taking things that have been hurt and wounded by sin and this decaying world and making them new. I have watched the beauty of this play out in my own home. I am so thankful that I had a husband who, while he did not get to raise the girls, made sure they got here. And I am eternally thankful to God, who did not let me walk away from the dream that He gave me as a young child.